We are gathered where the Squamish settlement of Kemkemale once stood, and it was also a gathering place used by the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam for thousands of years. At the office, we recognize that all people in British Columbia have an individual and a collective responsibility to work towards right relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of these lands. This includes the realization of thriving Indigenous legal and government systems. I want to thank you for joining us for the release of Unmediated, the report of the Commissioner's inquiry into the exclusion of media from the Hastings decampment in April 2023. The format for this press conference will be remarks from Commissioner Kasari-Govender. This will be followed by a question and answer period. At that time, Commissioner Govender will be joined by Carly Hyman, our office's general counsel and lead for inquiries. There are hard copies of the report available to those in the room, and an electronic copy is now available on our website at bchumanrights.ca/unmediated for those watching online. To introduce Unmediated, the report of the Commissioner's inquiry into the exclusion of media from the Hastings decampment in April 2023 is BC's Human Rights Commissioner. Commissioner Kasari-Govender began her work as BC's first independent Human Rights Commissioner in 2019. As an independent officer of the legislature, Commissioner Govender is uniquely positioned to ensure human rights in BC are protected, respected, and advanced on a systemic level. Her work as commissioner includes public inquiries into the experiences of hate in the pandemic and detentions under the Adult Guardianship Act, a report on systemic discrimination in policing, community-embedded research about a range of human rights issues experienced by people living in British Columbia, public awareness campaigns about ableism and racism, and mis and disinformation, and guidance to government that, among other things, inform the creation of both the Anti-Racism Data Act and the Anti-Racism Act. I'd like to invite up Commissioner Kasari-Govender to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's report release. Today, I'm honored to be releasing the results of our recent inquiry into the use of media exclusion zones during police actions, particularly focused on the decampment along Hastings Street in Vancouver in April 2023. And I want to acknowledge, as Stephanie did before me, that we are doing so on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This inquiry was intended to shine a light on the importance of press freedom by examining the restrictions imposed by the City of Vancouver and the Vancouver Police Department during this decampment. Under the Human Rights Code, I have broad powers to initiate an inquiry where I am of the view that inquiring into a matter would promote or protect human rights in the province. I decided to inquire into the reported restrictions on media during the downtown Eastside decampment because a free press is critical to a functioning democracy. The inquiry examined whether and why media and others were restricted from the Hastings decampment on April 5th and 6th, 2023. I examined whether the restrictions comply with human rights protections for freedom of the press and freedom of assembly in domestic and international law. The inquiry also examined the process followed by the Vancouver Police Board and the Vancouver Police Department's consideration and investigation of a complaint about the creation of the media exclusion zone. Freedom of the press is essential to ensuring we have shared truth in our society. That is a shared understanding of facts and experiences that allows us to make informed political decisions and have constructive debates. Shared truth is also a foundation for human rights. Human rights protections rely on the shared truth that protecting and respecting human dignity is essential to a well-functioning society and to the well-being of people in it. While we examined only 2 days on one street in one city, we took on this topic because we wanted to ensure that any restrictions on freedom of the press anywhere in the province comply with law, including human rights protections, especially those involving police actions around marginalized people. We don't have to look far to see the dangers and risks of unchecked power and just how fragile our democratic institutions really are. The role of journalists in informing the public about state actions is vital to shine a light on human rights violations against vulnerable people, raise public awareness, and prevent organizations, people, and governments from breaching others' human rights with impunity. Given the importance of media to a functioning democracy, any restriction on media freedom should be taken seriously and reviewed carefully, especially when the source of authority for the restriction is not so clear and obvious. Complaint processes applicable to violations of those freedoms must provide effective access to remedy, as a right without a remedy is meaningless. Internationally, nationally, and locally, journalists encounter challenges in doing their work, especially where they report on protests, often related to issues affecting the human rights of marginalized people. Many of these issues present themselves to some degree in Canada. Reporters Without Borders, which publishes a World Press Freedom Index, ranks Canada's environment for journalism 21st out of 180 countries in 2025, down 7 places from 2024. Since 2016, their annual assessment has concluded that the state of press freedom in Canada is satisfactory rather than good. Within Canada, BC often leads other provinces in the number of incidents affecting press freedom per year. In recent years, journalists have faced criminal charges and have had to go to court to ensure they can access places that might otherwise be restricted by injunctions. While many of these incidents have corresponded with press reporting on Indigenous land defense protests, journalists reporting on forced eviction of tent encampments have also seen a notable increase in restrictions across the country, including in Toronto in the summer of 2021, in Vancouver during the forced evictions in the downtown side on April 5th and 6th, 2023, and reportedly in Crab Park in April 2024, in Edmonton in January 2024, and in Kelowna in April 2025. While this inquiry is not an investigation of decampment practices and their human rights implications, it is important to note that it is important to provide the context for encampments as part of the context for this exclusion zone. As I said elsewhere, encampments are no one's idea of an ideal solution to homelessness. But they are home for those who live there. Shelter from the elements, a place to keep belongings, a bed to rest one's head, and a community to which to belong. These facts alone create human rights obligations for all levels of government and representatives of the state. And forced eviction is a serious violation of human rights, often involving highly marginalized people who are disproportionately Indigenous and living with disabilities. Human rights advocates and the press must be permitted to work without unreasonable interference to gather and distribute information about incidents of forced eviction in order to protect the rights of unhoused people. As noted by one encampment resident after his belongings were destroyed during an eviction in Prince George, he said, "I want the court and this city to know we are people and we exist. We just want to survive and be treated like human beings. What was done to us was very hurtful." It is with these concerns in mind that I decided to undertake this inquiry, which began on December 12th, 2023. There is significant public interest in having an accurate account of what occurred in April 2023 and in better understanding the emergent practice of creating exclusion zones during the eviction of homeless encampments and otherwise, notably done without court authorization and therefore only on the basis of court police discretion. As a result, my recommendations are specific to inclusion zones imposed without court authorization or injunction. During this inquiry, we gathered extensive records from the City of Vancouver, the Vancouver Police Department, and the Vancouver Police Board. We interviewed under oath staff from the city and the Vancouver Police Department who were involved in the decampment and media who were present during the decampment. We held 3 engagement sessions with members of the media and community organizations who support people living in the downtown east side. We also reviewed photographs and videos provided by members of the media, as well as the BPD's computer-aided dispatch transcripts, recording of police radio broadcasts, and scribe notes from the Vancouver Police Department commanding officers. I want to thank everyone who was involved in this inquiry process, including those who testified, those who gathered and submitted documentary evidence, experts who shared their insights, leadership of the organizations involved, and our staff team poured countless hours into this investigation and report. As a preliminary point, the term exclusion zone was a point of contention in this inquiry. In my view, the definitions suggested by the Vancouver Police Department and the city, and the distinctions drawn between exclusion zones, work zones, safety zones, these are overly formal distinctions and are not based in principle or in law. An exclusion zone is the closure or regulation of any form of access, including media access, to public space. We use the term exclusion zone to cover a variety of circumstances because of their similar effect on restricting media access to specific areas, potentially hindering the ability to gather and distribute information to the public. The human right to press freedom may be affected by partial as well as total restrictions. As described by one engagement participant, access delayed is access denied. In this inquiry, I make 3 findings. First, transparency was compromised during the Hastings decampment. Despite claims from the city and the Vancouver Police Department that media were only restricted during the first 45 minutes of the decampment, the evidence showed that the Vancouver Police Department restricted media and others from accessing defined zones throughout April 5th and 6th. While the VPD allowed a pool camera arranged into the exclusion zone approximately 30 minutes after the beginning of the operation, all other media access had to be approved through a chain of command. Many media were denied entry into the exclusion zone for various lengths of time. Of the 10 journalists interviewed for this inquiry, 8 were restricted from entering the zone in some way. 2 reported never gaining entry, while others were either eventually let in or went down back alleys to gain access. Most of the journalists who entered the exclusion zone, either with permission or on their own impetus, were not asked to leave. However, we heard of 3 instances where reporters inside the exclusion zone were asked to move back behind the police lines again. In many cases, we were able to coordinate the media stories, corroborate the media stories either with their own records or with records provided by the Vancouver Police Department. In some, the evidence showed that media did not have unfettered access at any time on those 2 days. The exclusion of media meant that their ability to report on the decampment was hindered, and therefore transparency was compromised. The second finding is that the exclusion zone was not in accordance with human rights standards. The explanation for the exclusion zone varied widely from April 5th until the date of publication of this report. Explanations included safety concerns for the press, the presence of big trucks in the area, reputational risks for the city and the province, operational efficiency, privacy concerns for the encampment residents, and staff safety from advocates and protesters. The evidence demonstrates a level of disorganization and a lack of internal clarity that compromised access to the media as it was occurring, and therefore to public transparency. In the end, I conclude that the zone had the primary purpose of preventing safety concerns, including issues associated with the protests. However, the impact of the media was not adequately considered, and the potential risks to staff and public safety did not justify the broad restrictions. I found that the VPD did not have statutory or common law authority for the exclusion zone, and therefore that it was unlawful. Or rather, it was unlawful. Part of the unlawfulness rests in the disproportionate effect of the decampment on marginalized groups, especially Indigenous people and people with disabilities, which then results in the restrictions on media being disproportionately experienced by those groups. This perpetuates systemic discrimination, contrary to the Human Rights Code. I accept the city and VPD's perspective that they took steps to provide for media access and that they believed they had safety issues to manage, including protecting the physical and mental safety of city staff. These are important goals. However, the city and VPD officials were required by law to balance managing those potential safety risks without unnecessarily or unreasonably restricting freedom of the press and freedom of assembly in a manner that was proportional to the risks identified. The evidence showed that the VPD and the city did not give due regard to the human rights, importance of the human rights at stake. In prioritizing safety over freedom of the press and freedom of assembly without balancing the degree of safety risk, the city and the VPD failed to ensure that the restrictions on these freedoms were proportionate, which they are required to do so by law. Police discretion must be exercised in alignment with human rights protections in order to protect democracy, uphold the rule of law, and promote safety for all. A fact well accepted in our Constitution and in our justice system in this province and in this country. The extent or scope of the impact on access to information is difficult to define. However, it's clear that harm was done. We heard from members of the media that the media restrictions in this case, even where journalists were eventually able to enter the zone, had the effect of impairing media from reporting on the full story of the forced eviction of the residents of the Hastings encampment. Members of the media testified that they were unable to effectively report from behind police lines. Finally, my third finding is that the oversight process followed by the Vancouver Police Board in investigating a complaint it received about the creation of the exclusion zone was insufficient. I found that the investigator assigned to investigate the complaint was not sufficiently independent because that investigator was also the gold commander with overall operational responsibility for the decampment. The complaint was not adequately investigated and considered by the VPD and the Vancouver Police Board due to insufficiencies in this investigative process. The board is required to follow fair administrative processes, which it did not do in the investigation of this complaint. In sum, the process for ensuring oversight was significantly compromised. As a result of these findings, I've made 6 recommendations, all of which need to be implemented in a way that promotes and protects the rights of people who are unhoused or otherwise impacted by exclusion zones. My first recommendation is that the VPD and the City of Vancouver, as well as all other police departments and municipal governing bodies in BC, should immediately cease excluding or restricting media from areas around police action without explicit judicial authorization, unless required by immediate and unforeseeable circumstances limited to a credible and substantial threat to public safety in accordance with the law or for the integrity of a criminal investigation. If an exclusion zone, as defined by this report, is required in these circumstances, every reasonable effort must be taken to mitigate the impact on freedom of press. In other words, I'm recommending that police and municipalities seek judicial authorization where they believe it is necessary to create an exclusion zone, except in very limited circumstances that could not be anticipated. Notably, in this case, the decampment was planned ahead of time, and the city and police had advance notice of the risks they were balancing, yet did not seek a court order to allow them to establish the zone. In addition, I recommend that the provincial government introduce law to enshrine this directive on when media exclusions may be established without an injunction. I also recommend rights-based training for all frontline police officers and commanders, both on protecting press freedom and freedom of association, and that funding be provided, for an organization to provide legal advice to media and media organizations who encounter legal and policy issues concerning freedom of the press. My 5th recommendation is that the Vancouver Police Board should amend its policy regarding handling of service and policy complaints to require that all complaints are handled fairly and rigorously, including by ensuring that members involved in the matter under investigation are not tasked with investigating their own actions or those of their superiors, and that all handling of complaints is addressed in a manner that is free from conflicts of interest, whether real or perceived, and is transparent. My final recommendation is that the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General should introduce amendments to the Police Act to improve the independence and protections for procedural fairness in the complaint process. With significant power comes significant responsibility to exercise that power in accordance with the law and within the bounds of human rights protections. Oversight is critical to ensuring public trust in policing institutions. These recommendations provide guidance to municipalities, to police, and to the provincial government about what the law already requires. None of the recommendations today create new legal responsibilities. The constitutionally protected rights to peaceful protest and freedom of the press are essential to a functioning democracy. Police must take clear and careful steps to protect both, especially in the absence of significant and compelling evidence to risk to public safety. These steps were not taken in this case. As noted, the city and the VPD failed to strike the appropriate balance between potential safety and other risks with the right to freedoms of the press and peaceful protest. Perhaps most jarringly, the process that was followed in responding to the complaint was deeply flawed, leaving questions about the effectiveness of police board oversight and the process for resolving service and policy complaints for rights violations of these kinds. The human right to freedom of the press is rendered meaningless without access to an effective remedy. Thank you for your interest in the results of this inquiry. My colleague Carly Hyman and I are now happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Govender. We have now reached the portion of the press conference where the Commissioner and Carly Hyman, General Counsel for the office, will take questions. For media watching online, you may text your questions for the Commissioner to 604-306-7369. That's 604-306-7369. That's the number you've previously been given as well. We will read out your questions for Commissioner response. For media in the room, when you're ready to ask a question, please raise your hand or otherwise indicate. Daryl Greer, Canadian Press.
Can you perhaps detail what rebuke or consequences for unlawful actions that the police board, the city, or the BPD could or should or will face for taking this action that you deemed unlawful?
So my authority under the Human Rights Code allows me to compel evidence, to require people to testify. It allows us to do the kind of deep research that we've done here. And it allows me to make recommendations that I can file with the legislature, which is what I've done here. It does not allow me to enforce my recommendations. It gives me some mechanisms to continue to monitor what duty bearers are doing, so what the police and the ministries and the cities are doing, but it doesn't allow me to force them to comply with the recommendations, unfortunately. We will be taking all those steps around monitoring and working with all of the duty bearers to try to help them and implement these recommendations where there's willingness to do so.
I suppose what I mean is that if they broke the law, will they face any consequences for doing so?
Not as a result of this inquiry. This is not findings of civil or criminal liability in an inquiry process. Whether there's other processes that get followed are outside of my control, but the ones within our control are not about fault finding as much as let's create some recommendations for what to do going forward.
Have you had conversations with the Ministry of Public Safety or with the BPD Police Board or with municipalities, like direct conversations, and gotten a sense of whether these different bodies are willing to implement the recommendations?
In response to our questions about that willingness, we have understood that there is not a willingness to implement the recommendations from the parties directly involved. So those, the City of Vancouver, the Vancouver Police, Board Department, and the ministries. Well, I will leave it to you to talk to them directly about what those reasons are. I understand that one of the concerns is around restricting police discretion. And to that, I would say that this doesn't create new legal obligations. This simply talks about how to implement existing legal obligations. Police discretion is already required to follow the law. It's required to implement the law, including human rights law. So these legal obligations exist already, and that police discretion is limited in a variety of ways already. Of course, they can't, for example, conduct a strip search or invade someone's home without some legal protections, right? We know that, we know there's search warrants and so on. This is part of that same puzzle. We need to have protections for people's human rights. That said, we've also heard from about half the municipalities, about half of the municipalities that we heard from in response to these recommendations indicated that they would be following. So we do have many municipalities across the province who have agreed to implement the first recommendation, which is around stopping, not implementing any exclusion zones except in accordance with these specific conditions that we've laid out in the recommendation.
So just to clarify, the city of Vancouver though has specifically said they don't want to follow the recommendation. Could you tell me what the city of Victoria has said?
Off the top of my head, I believe the response from the city of Victoria was that they support the spirit and intent of the recommendation and that they were willing to work with the police department to implement it. That's what I recall.
Okay, I'm just trying to think of municipalities that are relatively large and do have large encampments.
I just had a bit of a double barrel question. Was the police department able to clearly articulate the safety concerns that they were trying to prevent? Was it slip and falls? Was it people getting hit by a truck? Like, because, you know, for those of us who were there, seeing members of the public mill about without any restriction and workers who were there, people who own businesses within the zone were free to go. It was just, it was very difficult to understand what safety concerns they had for people who were there to cover it versus people who were just there in the community working or living as normal.
I think there was never a really clear articulation of what the risk was to media themselves. I think I didn't find that the intent was actually to exclude media. It's just that not enough attention was paid to why the right to a free press was important and how that needed to be balanced. The reasons offered for the exclusion, as I noted, varied quite widely from the time we started this inquiry right to the date of publication. So they included safety risks from big trucks. They included safety risks from protesters to city staff. So the big trucks were potentially risk to media themselves. The city was concerned around risk to their staff, around protesters or advocates who might be in this space, and that was a justification for the exclusion. We heard reputational risks for the city and the province. We heard about operational concerns, just making sure it all went smoothly. So there's a wide variety of reasons offered for the exclusion.
What is a reputational risk? What did they say this is going to make us look bad, so we didn't want people to take pictures? Like, I don't understand that particular term. If it can be elaborated on, that would be very helpful.
I think that's a question for the police rather than me. There is some detail in the report. We could perhaps pull that line out. The Gold Commander noted, so as and what we saw, things were either pushed out in the media, how that is actually going to affect the public's view. How is that actually going to affect the public's view of the Vancouver Police Department? This is a city-led initiative, so what's the reputational risk to the city of Vancouver? This is also being led ultimately by the Ministry of the Attorney General and the Ministry of Housing. They claimed ownership over this entire operation from an uber strategic outlook. So there is risk to the provincial government in both of those ministries. So I have to look at all of those and then make a determination on what is an operational plan and what's the best way to proceed or not. And then the other ultimate risk was parts of our briefing with the Attorney General and the Ministry of Housing were leaked and disclosed. That's on page 78 of the report.
Just one last question. I'm sorry to keep going. The transcripts of the under oath testimony from the people that you spoke to, are those by any chance?
We're not releasing the full transcripts, but there's extensive quotes throughout the report. And there are details in the appendix to the report of what we heard from individual media. So we've summarized in the report they provide a more extensive summary than I did in my speaking notes. So we interviewed 10 people, 2 never made their way in. There's much more detail, but in the appendix, there's much more extensive detail about what we heard from each reporter about their experience.
I'm more saying like the city officials, the police, the under oath testimony that they gave, was there because You know, if they were telling you one thing that was contrary to what actually happened, they would have perjured themselves, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, we have, I'm confident that as much as possible, we've been able to discern what happened in the report. We have, you know, the testimony for sure from police. We have their scribe notes, so we heard much of, you know, what was happening at the time. We had notes from their radio transcripts, or we had the transcripts from the radio transmissions, and we had testimony from media. So we have put all of those together, and you can see on specific points of evidence how I've weighed that evidence and how I've assessed where the truth lies. So definitely some points of contradiction that we've worked through and tried to resolve in the course of the report.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few questions from folks online, from Sonal Gupta from the National Observer. What precedents does this report set nationally for police and government authorities when managing encampment clearings?
This report, the first recommendation is to cease the operation of exclusion zones. That is exclusion zones how we've defined them rather than how the police might define them. As I say, we had some pushback on how we have defined exclusion. So any restriction of media has to follow, in our recommendation, these guidelines, which is to not implement, language up, to immediately cease excluding or restricting media from areas around police action without explicit judicial authorization. This is, so we're talking about circumstances where there isn't an injunction to implement. So that's one key piece. So where they don't have an injunction, they should not have exclusion zones unless required by immediate and unforeseeable circumstances limited to a credible and substantial threat to public safety or for the integrity of a criminal investigation. So only to have exclusion zones or restriction of media in those very limited circumstances. In British Columbia, the follow-up recommendation is that that be enshrined in law. That is not a recommendation for the rest of the country simply because I don't have jurisdiction over the rest of the country and jurisdiction here in British Columbia.
Thank you. Another question from Sonal Gupta. Commissioner, the report links media work zones and arrests to encampment clearings and Indigenous land defense actions across Canada. Based on what you found in Vancouver, what should citizens be asking about how often police are restricting press access in ways that also hide what's happening to Indigenous people on the ground?
I think, you know, one of the reasons that we conducted this inquiry was to kind of pay attention to the canaries in the coal mine. To look at, you know, again, this was one circumstance in one city, but we see the echoes across the country. In the specific legal context of this, it's where there isn't an injunction, where there isn't a court order. We do see that increasing across the country, particularly, you see the use of exclusion zones increasing across the country, particularly in the context of encampments. So what my hope is in those contexts that media working in those zones, police and municipalities trying to decide what to do in those zones will look to the guidance we provided here and understand that people are watching. Part of this was to shine sunlight on an issue that could otherwise go sort of unnoticed by the public. I think that's incredibly important in a context, global context in which freedom of the press is becoming, you know, even among countries where we might have taken it for granted, once upon a time becoming more and more restricted and more endangered. So I hope this report allows people the insight to be able to ask the questions about, am I getting the full story? Am I getting the full picture? And to expect that they would get the full picture of what's happening from police actions, particularly in the context of marginalized individuals. While the legal recommendations here are in a different context than many Indigenous land defenders and resource extraction projects where exclusion zones are being set up, some of the same principles, broad principles apply, which is freedom of the press is a constitutionally protected right and a human right. So is freedom of assembly or peaceful protest, and we need to be paying attention and protecting those through our justice systems and through the available mechanisms.
Thank you. The next question is from Jeremy Ainsworth of BC Today. He says, I was the first reporter there. I did not see any officers looking after safety concerns, nor were there protesters within the zone. How much credibility does the commissioner give the police and city evidence on this?
I accept that the city of Vancouver and the police were concerned about safety issues. I accept that there was a genuine intent to take care of safety. I do not accept that there was an appropriate balancing of the interests of the media and freedom of the press and the human rights concerns at stake, and not just the interests of media. Of course, for most people, what we're concerned about is what press we get, what freedom of the press may impact reporters immediately, but it impacts all of us in the long term. And so that needs to be balanced. Police have a legal obligation to balance the degree and the likelihood of those safety risks against the importance of the human rights protections here. And that did not happen in this particular circumstance. That balancing didn't happen, and appropriate weight to these rights and freedoms was not given.
Thank you. I have one further question from folks online, and then we'll go back in the room. Given your findings, do you believe the exclusion of media at the Hastings decampment reflects a systemic pattern in Canada? And what concrete safeguards are needed to prevent similar restrictions on press freedom in future public interest events? How soon should the public expect these recommendations to be acted on?
So the first part about that question, I think we did see an emerging pattern of restricting freedom of press in British Columbia and across the country, which is what led us to want to do this inquiry. Before that momentum took off even more. I do think it's a significant issue that needs to be paid attention to and part of that overall pattern. In terms of the timing of the recommendations or timing of change, our first recommendation is immediate, that all municipalities and police departments should immediately cease excluding or restricting media in these ways, except for these very limited circumstances. Again, whether those actions will actually happen, I'm not able to legally enforce those. We do have promises from a number of municipalities across the province that they will take that action. We do not have those promises from police departments.
Thank you. We have time for one more question from the room. Does anybody have a question left in the room?
It sounds like for the bodies that are not interested in implementing the recommendations, the only avenue for press freedom to get that accomplished would be for maybe a coalition of media organizations to launch a court challenge, like a civil action. Is that your assessment?
Again, this inquiry is not about finding civil or criminal liability. Certainly, that's an option that media can explore. And one of the recommendations that we've made is that where media run into problems in terms of getting access, that the government should be funding resources that provide legal advice and support to organizations. And we mean that both in terms of individuals, so individuals who may be facing police repercussions because they're inside an exclusion zone or, push past police lines or so on, but also from a systemic perspective. And we specifically asked for funding for the ability to bring systemic challenges by media to protect freedom of press.
Not
Good luck with
to
that.
keep us here, but what we're hoping, I suppose what is confusing is that we're trying to figure out if there is any reasonable or realistic avenue for accountability for the unlawful acts that you found that these officials, in concert with each other, be it individual acts that added up or an accumulation that added up to the unlawful act. There's no avenue to be taken to ensure that they're accountable for taking unlawful action.
I'm not saying there's no avenue. I'm saying exactly that we are, one of our recommendations is to provide funding for legal support so that folks do have systemic remedies for systemic problems on freedom of the press.
So nobody's getting fired, though. Nobody's getting fired, nobody's going to jail, nobody's getting
I don't know
fined,
how.
they can just break the law with no consequence. That's kind of what I'm confused about, because if I steal a chocolate bar, I'll be in the jail cell across the street. But they can, take this pseudo-authoritarian action and break human rights law, or however you want to frame it, with no accountability whatsoever.
I don't have the power beyond doing an inquiry and monitoring and publishing the results of that monitoring to hold people to account or institutions to account. To hold people to account for human rights and constitutional violations requires bringing actions to either the Human Rights Tribunal or the court by impacted parties.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This concludes our media availability. If you're looking for more information about BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, including about our inquiries and past reports, you can visit bchumanrights.ca or follow us across social media using the handle at Human Rights for BC. If you'd like access to this particular report and all of the findings, you can go to bchumanrights.ca/unmediated. If you would like to follow up with a one-on-one interview with the Commissioner, she will be available in this room until 10:30. If you'd like to schedule something for later on, particularly for those on the phone or watching a live stream, please contact our office by emailing media@bchumanrights.ca and we'll get right back to you. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Commissioner Govender and Carly Hyman. This concludes today's media availability. Thank you.
Okay.